The way it's written is that it covers everything Medicaid covers, which in New York is like very comprehensive. It covers abortion, it covers trans health, like birth control, long-term disability, all of the good things. So it's legislation that's very close to my heart. And NYSNA has been like one of our main supporters. But there's like this interesting challenge where they like support this really great legislation, but they've also sort of like tied themselves very closely with Governor Cuomo, who I don't know how many New Yorkers are here, but like Governor Cuomo is the enemy. Like, yeah, please hit. Governor Cuomo can go fuck himself, right? I'm glad he's adopted Cynthia Nixon's entire platform. Like, it's not enough. Anyway. So it's like this very interesting challenge of like nobody's really working on this legislation because nobody wants to go up against Governor Cuomo. Which is all to say, like, this ties sort of into the strike is that they really have moved away from single-payer legislation and are now working on state staffing, which is great legislation. Nurses right now are terribly overworked. They can have upwards of like 8 to 10 patients at a time, which is completely ridiculous. It's not good for patient care, right? Like, you can't adequately manage 10 patients at a time. It causes people, causes healthcare complications. It causes people to die. It's really bad. And recently, they voted to strike over it, which was, I think, like a very exciting demand. The levels they were asking for was like, it was depending on like depending on like the department and like what specific care they were providing. But like, if you were in like the intensive care unit, it would be mandated that you can only have like 1 or 2 patients, down from like 10, right? Like radical change. And so they voted overwhelmingly, I think it was like 90-something% to maybe like 95, it was up there, to strike. However, they have not strike. They have, I think they're still in the process. The threat of a strike was enough to win enough, of their demands from the administration that I think they have managed to reach a tentative agreement and they're voting on it right now. And there's it's like this interesting divide between the nurses who are like, there are some who are really proud of what they did, as they should be. I think I'm not particularly well versed on the agreement, but it did include enforceable staffing protections that are significantly stronger than what they had previously, which was basically nothing. It was like a handshake deal of like, we're going to try to, give you ratios. But it's not as good as it could have been. And I think this really came from I think there has been from the nurses I've spoken to, there has been a big question about like whether or not NYSNA was truly strike ready and like what that means, because it was, they were covering, a couple different hospitals, with like uneven sort of organizing levels at each of them. And so I don't know, I want to just talk about this because I think it's important when we're working. I think DSA works best in coalition. And so but like these relationships can always be kind of complicated, especially with unions, who like are site places of struggle but are like also deeply bureaucratic. And so I think it's always interesting to see like how we relate to that and how can we respond to that, especially as like an outside organization. So I'm running out of time and I want to give you guys more time for discussion. So I think the question I want to pose to you is that, like, both in the Ain't I a Woman campaign and the NISNA strike, we're dealing with these campaigns are led and grounded in, like, the workers, right? The people who are enduring these conditions on a daily basis. And DSA is also often a coalition partner to support these stakeholders, right? And so, I don't know, I guess I wanted you guys to talk about, in your campaigns, like, how have you brought stakeholders into the work? Like, how are you, and it doesn't necessarily just have to be workers, but, like, how are we bringing patients? How are we bringing people of color? You know, how are we making sure that these campaigns are being led and organized by the people who are most affected? But, you know, so yeah, please get back into your groups and, like, discuss, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
5 minutes.
So I want to talk about this campaign.
Yeah? Who wants to? Yeah, you in the orange shirt.
Hi.
Oh, yeah.
I'm Georgia Chamber. The Pittsburgh DSA has been working with SWAT Pittsburgh, which is the Sex Workers Outreach Project. And one of the things that we've been doing in solidarity with them is doing some court watching, or attending what they call Pride Court, which is a prostitution conversion court. Part of that sort of coalition and working in solidarity with them is both attending court to show that we're there to support the sex workers and just to generally provide that support, but also because the court has been known to do some illegal nonsense, like taking the presiding judge will take people into his private chambers to make the court ruling. That's not legal. So being there to sort of call them out, and also because the sex workers themselves and the people that are part of SWAP often can't attend court because they will be identified. People, they'll call them out. The person that I've communicated with has been harassed by the bailiffs. So being able to go for them and do that work for them so that they don't have to be exposed to that environment, I think is valuable coalition work.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think it is very important for us to figure out how we can support and show solidarity with people who are more marginalized than the average demographics of DSA. We should be, as a mostly white organization, using our privilege as we try to diversify our ranks and show. I mean, that's what solidarity is right? It's it's putting ourselves on the line in support of others. All right, great. Thank you for sharing. Does anybody else want to share what they were talking about? Yeah, don't be shy. Yeah, Robbie, all the way in the back.
We didn't get to talk about some of our coalition work, but one example that I think can happen sometimes even in a really successful collaboration is when Long Beach was looking at sanctuary city legislation and the legal defense fund and all of that. The coalition was really excited to have DSA there because we're really loud and we're very brown in Long Beach and we're very unafraid and all of that sort of stuff is really useful. And then once the legislation got passed, all the meetings started being at 2 o'clock. So nobody who had a job could go because they felt now it was back in an institutional framework, and so it was no longer in the streets, right? And so we weren't used to them anymore. And so these little things, I think also we need to negotiate or just navigate in our coalition relationships of our principles, right? We have meetings on evenings and weekends because we have jobs, and we switch between evenings and weekends and day and online because we have people who work on evenings and weekends, right? And so that's not a principle that institutional players think about usually, right? And a lot of unions, like Jen was saying, or a lot of nonprofits are very professionalized, and so they see. So the relationships are different, the internal culture is different, and often the end goals are different. And so I think in a lot of cases that I've seen from around the country, it's really important to be clear about what our principles are and our desires are when we go into the coalition, or we'll be bad partners because we're not honest with ourselves about what we want, and we're not setting when do we step away, what are we willing to do, what are we not willing to do, and we want to think about, we want to be very intentional before we get pulled into institutional politics, right? You absolutely have to be in that world, but to be functional as a socialist, but it's different, and we just need to be aware of that. We need to have those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's also, especially when working in coalition, it's important to ask ourselves, what can we do that they can't? During the primary, DSA was able to go and bird dog Cuomo, right, in ways that, NYSA was never going to do, right? And so that may be, they may not love that, but, it's a way that we can push the conversation forward. Anyway, yeah, you in the back, you had your hand raised.
So we actually also didn't talk about this, but what I was going to say is my name is Rex, I'm from DSA, and I think we did have the open teacher strike, which we were super active in, but I think one of the things things that I took away from coalitions in that sense is that it's very easy to get to work with the top players of a union, but it's actually super important to remember the rank and file. So I think what we did really successfully in that effort is that while we were working with the union, and it was often really hard because they were making these decisions, and like we had to make decisions on the fly about how to feed 37,000 kids, and they were like not telling us like key information, you know? And so we were like trying to like not bring that, but one of the things that we did really well was start to like go fly in school, go work for teachers, you know? So at the end, even though the tentative agreement, or like the agreement that was passed was really controversial, the teachers themselves might have been pissed at the union, some of them, but they weren't pissed at us. So we were on the ground. And so I think that was like one of the most exciting things, like being able to support teachers, parents, students, and them as union members as well as the union, so that we don't get a great off them, but are still working.
Thank you.
Hey, you want to take the reins?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up, the A9 Woman campaign. This is actually my first time hearing about it, and I'm definitely going to look more into it. When I heard the phrase A9 Woman, I instantly thought about Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is a historical speech, Sojourner Truth, and it just reminds me that that black women, brown women have always had the brunt of this dehumanization when it comes to this work. So having groups like DSA, the allyships and support in the coalition is very imperative to this work, because if we're going to be socialists and we're going to move this work forward, we have to align ourselves with each other. We have to see, where our privilege lies and use it to our advantage. Because it's very important, because a cop confronting me is going to look differently from a cop confronting a white woman. So thank you for talking about the A9 Woman campaign, and I encourage everyone to look into that campaign and support. Because as the person said back there, like, you have to be on the ground. You have to talk to the teachers. You have to, be involved. So that's just very important to do, because it is hard working with unions. Even though they're there to support workers, a lot of times it is very bureaucratic, and that's very historical. So my name is Aurica Hurst. I go by Hershey. And I will be talking about the war on drugs, restitution, and recovery. And I just wanted to say the definition of restitution, because I think that that's what all of our groups here are working on, restitution, which is the restoration of something lost or stolen to the proper owner. So we us as humans, that's being stolen from us, our inalienable rights, they're being stolen from us as humans, as women, as non-binary people. In general, like, we're being dehumanized, and we can see this happening to people that are dealing with abortion, people that are dealing with sex work and health home aid work. We're being dehumanized in all these categories. So restoration for all of us. The war on drugs, and particularly for me as a black woman, and organizing in Philadelphia and being able to have the privilege to go to other spaces like Arizona and Nevada and organize there with immigrants and what I call black and brown folks who are most affected by these issues but aren't closely connected to the policy making that will affect them. So we have a little bit of time, so I'm just going to read this off some notes I've been writing since I found out I was going to be a part of this panel. So the matter of war on drugs is a matter of race. Again, being a commodity in this country, the war on drugs. Because it goes back way before the Nixon era. But that's when policy started to come about. And then in the 90s, we had these terms being used called super predators. So we all know by now that the war on drugs was manufactured by policy making in the latter half of the 80s into 90s that intentionally targeted black and Hispanic communities. Countless research has been done, so we're not lacking in research. You can pull up any research and find that, yes, black men were primarily the target from research done by these political scientists. One of them, by the name of a man who actually is a professor at the University of Penn, who coined the term super predator, John J. DiIulio Jr., who was a political scientist, professor at UPenn, and wrote that these super predators, they're going to grow. So he stated this all back in the early 90s and said that super predators are young juvenile criminals, more than likely young black men, who will do what comes naturally: murder, rape, rob, assault, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, and get high. So this was a political scientist that was stating that this is going to be a boom of young black males, and by 2005 it's going to be a bloodbath because these young black men are just going to go out and pillage. This is not new. This is very familiar. Post-Civil War, lynchings of black men increased because of this omnious storytelling of, at the time, what I assume to be cisgender white men who said that black men are going to go out and rape pure white women. And as we know, that's false, because actually black women were being raped on birthing farms. So when we look at this now in 2019, and there's a very important election coming up, the 2020 election, we have to look at the historical context in which we talk about black and brown people and how they're demonized through policy, and how can allyship and coalitions build power in these areas where people are being criminalized and dehumanized, all on the basis of color of skin. And so I like, even though this is a very jury, topic, like I said, I'm from Southwest Philadelphia and I grew up here. I've had a countless number of friends, families, associates that are still to this day incarcerated because of the war on drugs. So we have to look at this historical context and see why is policy still being introduced to this day that really focuses on this. So nothing's really changing. Nothing's changing at all. Only thing that's changing now is that there's a different face on the people that are now using drugs increasingly, and now there's a lot of support happening for these folks. And that's important, because I don't want to see people dead on the street. I'd rather people be safe. I'd rather people get the support they need. But I can't, as a black organizer, just look at that and say, that's great, end of story. I'm still in my community where people are dealing with the war on drugs. And I think all of us here, I think we kind of came to the conclusion, like, this is trauma. In all of these areas, trauma is happening. Trauma is happening, and no one's doing anything about it. They're just incarcerating more people. They're dehumanizing more people, and policies are being constructed. So just to hop back a little bit on the timeline, in the 90s, after the super predator research came out and people ran with it, there were about 40 states in the United States. So that's half the country, over half the country, that now are passed laws to charge juveniles as adults in this country. So juveniles, 16, 17-year-olds that are being charged as adults for drug offenses. For drug offenses. So at 16, in a lot of countries, so in Arizona, in California, Florida, Michigan, in Arizona, a state government report for fiscal year 2015 found that 224 youth directly filed and judicially waived into the adult system. So these are policies. There's what I would call like your justice loopholes. So these transfer laws are supporting juveniles being transferred to states where they can be tried as adults. And that's alarming, because then you have a whole generation of black males, women, non-binary folks just being targeted at really high rates, and then being put into a system that is not supporting them, is not dealing with their trauma, is not dealing with the fact that their neighborhoods had no resources, and that the only resources for these black and brown communities for males was drugs, and for young women was sex work, right? Because there's no jobs there. There's no policy like, we have to, when we put this thing in this neighborhood, we have to make sure it's trauma-informed care there, that there are jobs there, and that there's counselors there. No, the exact opposite are happening. Right down the street on 47th and I believe 47th and Fairmount, around there's a juvenile justice center. Why was that put there and not a healing or trauma-informed care facility for all the drugs and violence and murder that happens in the city of Philadelphia? So I think that when you have the privilege and your groups talking about what you can do as a coalition and how you can enforce policy or affect change, you got to look at the people that are most affected by it and what policies are being passed and how we can use our privilege in ways to shape things up, and how this is most affecting the people of of Black and brown communities and how trauma is being not addressed, but being dehumanized. People are being targeted mainly just because they're Black or they're brown or they look suspicious. And it's upsetting because a lot of times we are left out of the conversations of the policy making. We're left out of the policy making, and a lot of times we're left out of the coalition building because of different barriers like time, like how many Black and brown mothers or fathers can actually like stop their day and like, I'm going to go to this meeting. So how can we make our coalitions more, I guess, open to people that look like me, that want to be part of the conversation but can't be there? Can they call in? Can they check in? Can they stop by? A lot of times in college, I work 2 different jobs, so I use my professor's office hours. Or there are different hours where people can check in with DSA coalition leaders about, hey, this is happening in my community, and I'm not able to be at the meetings, but I want to be a part of this. I see you guys affecting change, and I love it. That's why I'm like, DSA, you guys are my allies. And I think we need to look more at allyship and look more about how we can like open up and like stop the barriers and open up. How are we addressing these state senators, legislators that aren't addressing wage theft? Right? That's illegal. That's fuck. Yeah. Right? Right? I thought slavery ended. I guess not. Because that's slavery. If you're working, you're not getting paid, that's slavery. So we have to call out these things for one, and we have to look at our privileges in a way that can drop down big walls and open up these barriers so that people that look like me and that maybe identify similarly to me as marginalized, they can be a part of these conversations without feeling like, I don't know what to do. Obviously, there's no legislative support. City council is a joke. Different agencies that are supported by government funding, we know those are being cut. So how can I, as a coalition or a chapter, bring in these people that maybe don't look like me, but I'm here as a socialist fighting for these things because I want these people to be a part of it. So I don't have any questions, but if people have questions for me, I got a lot of my information from sentencingproject.org.
Can you say that again?
Sentencingproject.org.
I wanted to add one thing that I was thinking. So when you were saying about how politicians are coming up with these policies, but who are they? Are they actually bringing like Black and brown people into that conversation? Right. It makes me think about Elizabeth Warren's recent policy for addressing Black mortality rate in the United States, where about punishing hospitals, and it's like, did you actually have a conversation with the people that this affects? Because that anybody, I feel like, can tell her that that's not going to work. Right. So I feel like that's a good example of what you brought up. Because it's like, who did you talk to?
Yeah, who did you talk to?
Yeah.
Do they look like the people that are most? Do they look like the people most affected by this issue? The question is like, if this is like not like a big trigger for you, then you're probably like most not affected by this issue. And you probably should use your power in a way that brings someone that's triggered or most affected by the issue to the table. How can I leverage my privilege in a way that I can bring somebody that is most affected by this issue to the table instead of like standing on my high horse or my platform and being like, I know what to do. You actually don't, and that's okay. Because the man that thinks he knows everything knows nothing. So we really have to, like, I like that you brought that up. Because, a lot of people rally behind all these people that are running, and I just want to say, who looks like the people affected by this? And are those people actually bringing those people to the table? Because if you're introducing legislation that is clearly problematic or making people feel more guilty about the issue, then that's not helpful. I took some quotes from the website, and I'm just gonna like finish it off with just kind of saying that quote and then just asking a rhetorical question. But the criminal justice system on the jurisdictions in these different states that use these transfer laws erases the jurisdiction when they are arrested. And when they say they, the young Black men or Black women, non-binary, or when these young people of color are arrested, the law totally goes out the window is basically what it's saying. That the law that protects these people totally goes out the window. And I would just like to point out that there was a case where this young white male raped a girl outside, did not serve any jail time at all, but he raped someone. Just think about if that was a young Black male that raped someone behind a dumpster and committed that same crime. Do we honestly believe that this Black male would go away without serving any time or just a probation? So these policies that happen in these courtrooms, we look at the criminal justice system in a way that are we actually looking at the law, or should we actually be looking at the bias that happens in courtrooms? Policy can create, policy can do whatever. In theory, it works, right? But in practicum, it comes down to people's biases. And how can we, as a collective, fighting for what we believe in as a socialist groups of people, socialist like-minded people, how can we look at bias in courtrooms and legislation when it comes to policy making? So thank you all.
I think we have time for 3 questions, so I'll open up the floor for anyone who have questions for our wonderful panelists.
Can I say something? Just something I've been thinking about as you were talking about mass incarceration is that, like, all incarceration is a health risk.
Yes.
Yes.
And there's this fantastic book I just read that you should check out. It's about Rikers Island specifically, which is the jail in New York, but it's called Life and Death on Rikers Island. It is frustratingly not a prison abolition book. Like, I don't know how you could go through this book and not think that, like, the system is unfixable. But it's the chief medical officer on Rikers Island talking about just the utter systematic failures of Rikers, and how I mean all of the health risks of incarceration basically come down that incarceration is torture.
Yes.
It's just torture,
yes.
Utter and straight. Whether that is solitary confinement, just a brutal environment where correction officers are able to inflict violence without any repercussion, or able to goad other prisoners into violence with zero repercussion. It's a chaotic, terrible environment. They systematically just deny health care to people, just for reasons. And so I think, as we're talking about decriminalization, mass incarceration, decriminalized sex work, like, all of these things tie in. I wish I had time to talk about the Save Allen Psych Ward, because mental health and incarceration are deeply linked to each other. And all of these, mass incarceration is a health issue.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things happening in Philadelphia, but I would like to point out there's one campaign called Close the Creek campaign. Close the Creek, and it's led by Just Leadership, and it's about closing the House of Corrections in Philadelphia. And when that's closed, money can come from that, and that money, Mayor Kenny promised to take that money and invest it into community. So how can we address all the trauma that happens because when people are incarcerated, it's just not the person that's incarcerated that's traumatized. All right, there are people the family members, the friends, the traveling upstate. How much does that cost? So there's a lot that goes into it, but there are things that can be done when we come together and we support campaigns like Close the Creek and, Just Leadership, shout out to them, and just thinking about ways that what's happening right now, because it can become a topic where you feel like you can do nothing, but there are different campaigns you can kind of support that are effective when you are resilient, when you're like, I'm going to do what I need to do and be on the ground, Question?
This is towards Jen and her work on care workers and home care workers. My grandfather suffered and died due to dementia, and when he was at home, he had to be observed all day, and I was burden put upon my grandmother and my uncles who were nearby, and me. And the work just got too much, and we had to put him in a care home.
Yeah, and we've talked about this a lot with, like, social reproduction, and, like, that women are like the shock absorbers of austerity politics. So when we aren't able to have home health aides in the office, so, most of that work falls on the feminized people, or they're pushed out into institutions, which are even more expensive than home health workers, right? And are alienating from people. It takes people out of community, it puts them in institutions when it's really cheaper to just have people help at home. And I would love to talk to you more. I think we're getting signs from the back that we need to wrap up, but let's talk afterwards.
So I know that sexual liberation is great, and I want to be also inclusive of, when we're talking about sex work, how about those others who are in trade, who don't see it as empowering and see it as them being objectified, and that we also see places where it was decriminalized and legalized, such as in New Zealand. We see that Maori women were not consulted and they were not empowered from the beginning and are still not empowered when it was legalized. So how are we also being inclusive of those other women in the trade who aren't queer, who are from the global south?
Oh, I don't know much about sex work and criminalization of it. I just know people are constantly left out of the conversations all the time. So,
could you be more specific about? Because just because I wasn't quite understanding, like, in what way they were left out and what was done.
Well, I think like if we think about economics, right, and think about policy, if sex work is legalized, that would show people that it's okay to buy sex, and that's fine. But I wonder if the demand will increase, and in a racialized and gendered world, where will the supply come from if women who are privileged don't want to do that work anymore?
Just to add on to what Princess was saying, so she brought up the example of New Zealand. In New Zealand, over 80% of girls that are involved in the sex trade are Maori women. To the point where in New Zealand, Maori women are referred to as the forgotten women, the lost women, because 16-year-old, like, girls don't reach past 16 years old because they're, sentimental. So I think that's what we're trying to get at, right? Like, these women were not consulted. These women were never at the table. These girls are already, their land was colonized and their bodies continue to be colonized.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to sort of there are a divide of, there's like privilege, a divide of privilege, right, among sex workers themselves. All sex workers are not equal. There are, I think there is a big divide between like high-end sex workers who tend to be white, who tend to come from more privileged backgrounds, and low-income women of color who are often doing survival sex work, right? They're not doing it because it's empowering, they're doing it because it's the only option available to them. And I think this is, I don't have an answer for you because I'm not an expert in this. Are you an expert? Do you want to, if you could talk?
I'm not an expert.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, but that's why we're socialists, right?
Yeah.
Because these little tweaks under capitalism can only get you so far.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right? And it even shows that people just take it down. Like,
it just does not serve us.
And it's a good example of like a single policy change really not being able to address the issue. So you can decriminalize something, but you really have to make a bunch of different changes. And it seems like that's an example of a situation where that didn't happen, where they make one change and then they didn't actually meet the needs of a lot of people that were affected by it, which happens all the time. Sorry.
Let's get the conversation going. It's a wonderful, wonderful topic to discuss. Because lunch is next. Hungry, than I am. Well, thank you, Caleb. Thank you for your participation. The next session will be the keynote.